The warm glow of chandeliers bathed the restaurant in an elegant golden hue. LA Terrace wasn't just any restaurant. It was a symbol of exclusivity, a place where deals were made over vintage wine, and the clinking of silverware against porcelain plates was a quiet symphony of privilege. The patrons were the kind of people who appreciated discretion, the kind who could afford a meal that cost more than an average person's weekly groceries. JD Vance pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping into the polished interior, his presence immediately drawing subtle glances. He wasn't just any senator, he was a controversial one. A firebrand conservative, an outsider-turned-power player, a man who spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived the struggles he campaigned on. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years proving himself in rooms where he was never meant to belong. A hostess greeted him with a rehearsed smile, her sleek black dress blending perfectly with the upscale atmosphere. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, scanning her tablet. "Yes, Vance," he replied, his voice even polite. The hostess's fingers danced across the screen, her expression neutral. But then something shifted. Her eyes flickered, recognition dawning. It was subtle, just the tightening of her lips, the slight hesitation in her movements. But Vance noticed. He was used to it by now. "One moment, please," she said, before disappearing toward the back of the restaurant. JD Vance exhaled quietly, adjusting his tie. The air in the restaurant carried the scent of truffle risotto and aged bourbon. But beneath it, there was something else, a tension he couldn't quite place yet. He noticed a couple at the bar whispering, eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. Another table, an older man in a tailored suit, glanced up from his steak, his expression unreadable. Something was off. The hostess returned, but this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a man in his mid-40s approached, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. His name tag read manager. His walk was brisk, controlled. This was a man used to handling uncomfortable situations with grace. "Mr. Vance," the manager began, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm sorry, but we won't be able to serve you this evening." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, JD Vance simply stared, not out of shock, but because he knew what was happening. He just wanted to hear it confirmed. He felt the eyes of the restaurant on him, the weight of silent expectations hanging in the air. He could already see how this would play out. "I have a reservation," he said, his voice measured, giving the man a chance to correct himself. "I understand," the manager continued, shifting slightly, "but we reserve the right to decline service to any guest. It's our policy." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. JD Vance wasn't being turned away because of a dress code violation. He wasn't causing a disturbance. He had simply walked in, just like every other patron enjoying their filet mignon and handcrafted cocktails. But he was the problem. There was no need for an outburst. He had seen this game before. If he raised his voice, he'd be labeled aggressive. If he made a scene, he'd be the headline. "Conservative Senator sparks controversy at exclusive restaurant." Instead, he let the moment stretch, allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle in the air. The quiet murmurs in the background, the faint scrape of a chair against the floor, the flashing of a phone screen as someone, probably a journalist, had already started recording. He glanced at the manager, whose professional demeanor masked the slightest flicker of unease. Was this his decision, or had pressure from above forced his hand? Vance gave a slow nod. "I see." Then, calmly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and snapped a single photo of the restaurant sign. No words, no confrontation, just a quiet, deliberate action. The silence in the restaurant deepened. The moment had become something larger than itself. This wasn't just about one senator being denied service. It was about why, and everyone watching knew it. The manager swallowed, shifting on his feet. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said, though there was no real apology in his tone. JD Vance didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned, walking toward the exit, his footsteps slow, controlled. The second he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a refreshing shock. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Behind him, the hushed murmurs inside the restaurant were already rising. Then came the first ping on his phone, followed by another, and another. The story had already hit social media. Someone inside had posted it. The caption was simple but powerful. Senator JD Vance just got kicked out of LA Terrace for his political beliefs. Is this where we are now? Vance knew what was coming next. The explosion, the outrage, the divided responses, the endless cycle of discourse that would consume cable news for days. Some would say the restaurant had every right to deny him. Others would call it blatant discrimination. He had seen it all before. But this time, he wouldn't react the way they expected him to, because what he did next would change everything. The moment JD Vance stepped out of LA Terrace, the firestorm had already begun. Even before he reached his car, the glow of his phone screen told him everything he needed to know. Notifications flooded in, hundreds of them, each one marking the rapid spread of the controversy. The internet had already turned the incident into a battleground. Inside the restaurant, someone had taken a photo, perhaps even recorded a video, and posted it online. The caption was simple but explosive. Within minutes, the post had gone viral, drawing thousands of reactions. Outrage surged through conservative circles, who saw the event as yet another example of political discrimination. Others, however, cheered the restaurant's decision, calling it an act of resistance against a figure they despised. Headlines began rolling out almost instantly. The media machine had found its latest obsession. Breaking news banners lit up television screens, reporting that a sitting senator had been refused service at an upscale restaurant. Analysts and commentators wasted no time dissecting the situation. Some called it a blatant attack on free speech, a disturbing sign of increasing political polarization. Others defended the restaurant, arguing that businesses had the right to refuse service. The online comment sections turned into war zones. One side decried the move as hypocrisy, pointing out that those who once championed tolerance had now embraced exclusion. The opposing side insisted that political figures had consequences for their actions and that public spaces were no longer neutral. As the storm raged on, JD Vance remained quiet. No statements, no tweets, no immediate reaction. This was a deliberate decision. He had seen how these narratives played out before, how outrage could be a weapon, how silence could be strategy. Meanwhile, inside LA Terrace, the atmosphere had changed. The manager who had confidently denied service to the senator now found himself at the center of a much larger controversy than he had anticipated. The restaurant's phone rang nonstop, emails poured in, and its social media accounts were flooded with both praise and condemnation. Among the messages was one from the restaurant's owner, whose carefully worded email made it clear damage control was necessary. A public statement soon appeared on LA Terrace's official account. The wording was careful, designed to ease tensions without admitting wrongdoing. The statement claimed that the incident was not politically motivated, but rather a misunderstanding related to the establishment's policies. It attempted to defuse the situation by emphasizing respect and inclusivity. But the response only fueled the fire. Skepticism dominated the reaction. Few believed the explanation. The video evidence was already circulating, showing Vance calmly seated, dressed impeccably, with no visible reason to be removed other than who he was. People demanded accountability. Others doubled down on support for the restaurant, insisting that public figures like Vance represented ideologies that had no place in certain spaces. Outside the restaurant, the backlash escalated into something tangible. Protesters arrived within hours, their presence turning the quiet street into a scene of division. One group held signs condemning political discrimination, waving flags, and chanting about fairness and free speech. Another group gathered in opposition, carrying placards declaring that hate had no place in the city. By morning, LA Terrace had become a national flashpoint. The restaurant staff watched uneasily from the windows as news cameras set up across the street. Journalists lined the sidewalks, eager for interviews. The debate had outgrown the initial incident, morphing into something bigger, something reflective of a country deeply split along ideological lines. Meanwhile, JD Vance sat in the quiet of a dimly lit coffee shop in Ohio, far from the chaos unfolding in Los Angeles. The aroma of roasted beans filled the air, a stark contrast to the noise raging online. In front of him lay an open notebook, a blank page staring back. He had the power to respond, to add fuel to the fire if he wanted. But instead of anger, his thoughts led him somewhere unexpected. A single sentence formed in his mind, one that would not escalate the situation, but reshape it entirely. Rather than demand apologies or call for boycotts, he envisioned something entirely different. Later that afternoon, his phone's camera recorded a video that would once again change the trajectory of the conversation. The message was simple but unexpected. There were no attacks, no bitterness, no calls for retribution. Instead, he extended an invitation, not to politicians or media figures, but to the very staff who had turned him away. A meal, a conversation, a chance to sit at the same table despite their differences. The post went live, and within minutes, reactions flooded in. The internet, which had been so divided, now hesitated. The move was not what anyone had anticipated. The narrative had shifted in a single stroke. Now, the attention turned to the restaurant's response. Would they accept? Would they refuse? Either way, the decision was no longer just about JD Vance. It was about something far greater. The internet reeled. The moment JD Vance's video invitation went live, the trajectory of the controversy took an unexpected turn. For hours, the conversation had been locked in a cycle of outrage, accusations, and ideological warfare. But this was something no one had predicted. Rather than calling for protests, boycotts, or legal action, Vance had extended an offer. He had invited the very people who had denied him service to share a meal with him. No cameras, no politics, just a conversation. The simplicity of the gesture clashed violently with the way political scandals usually unfolded. It wasn't retaliation, it was an invitation to dialogue. Reactions flooded in immediately. Commentators scrambled to analyze his move. Some saw it as a brilliant strategy, a way to flip the controversy on its head and put the restaurant in a difficult position. Others dismissed it as performative, a calculated stunt meant to bolster his image. Yet, beneath the layers of cynicism, one undeniable truth remained. He had taken the higher ground. The attention now turned to LA Terrace. The restaurant, already overwhelmed by the media frenzy, now faced a question it hadn't anticipated. Would they accept the invitation? Would they reject it? Either choice carried consequences. For hours, there was silence. The restaurant's management deliberated behind closed doors. The owner, concerned about the potential fallout, consulted legal advisors, PR specialists, and even prominent figures in the city. The decision wasn't just about a meal. It was about taking a stance, about determining whether the business could withstand the next wave of scrutiny. Meanwhile, on social media, speculation ran rampant. Supporters of Vance applauded his restraint, his willingness to open a dialogue despite the blatant disrespect he had faced. His critics, however, searched for ways to dismiss the move. Some accused him of setting a trap, a way to humiliate the restaurant further. Others insisted that sitting down with someone like him would legitimize his beliefs. Then, at exactly 7:14 p.m., LA Terrace released a statement. The restaurant declined the invitation. The wording of the statement was precise, careful. It framed the refusal as a matter of principle, emphasizing that their decision had been made in alignment with their values. They claimed that their restaurant aimed to provide a safe and inclusive space for all guests, and engaging in a high-profile meeting with a political figure would not serve that mission. The reaction was immediate. Within minutes, the internet erupted again. Supporters of the restaurant celebrated the refusal, calling it a bold stand against normalization of what they saw as harmful rhetoric. They praised the decision as an act of resistance, proof that businesses could still control the spaces they operated. But on the other side, the backlash was fierce. The restaurant had not just denied service to a sitting senator. Now, it had rejected a peaceful conversation. The refusal painted the establishment not as a beacon of inclusivity, but as a place that deliberately shut down dialogue. The narrative shifted in real time. The fallout was swift. Conservative media outlets framed the restaurant's response as an indictment of modern political discourse, highlighting the hypocrisy of those who preach tolerance but refuse to engage with different perspectives. Headlines emerged questioning the values of a business that boasted of inclusivity while simultaneously closing its doors to an open conversation. Then came the economic impact. Overnight, reservations at LA Terrace dropped. Negative reviews flooded Yelp and Google, with users leaving one-star ratings and detailing the controversy in scathing comments. The restaurant's email inbox filled with messages, some from customers expressing disappointment, others from people vowing never to dine there again. At the same time, a wave of financial support arrived from progressive donors who sought to counteract the backlash. Some public figures encouraged people to book tables in solidarity, urging their followers to stand against what they called manufactured outrage. But the damage was already done. Outside the restaurant, the protests continued, growing in size and intensity. The two opposing crowds, once merely ideological opponents, now represented something deeper. The division had solidified. Those who supported Vance's call for dialogue stood their ground, while those who championed the restaurant's refusal dug in even further. Meanwhile, JD Vance remained silent. He watched the situation unfold from a distance, refusing to issue further statements. He had already made his move, and now, the consequences were playing out in full view of the public. By choosing to walk away from the cycle of outrage, he had turned to focus entirely on the restaurant's decision. And that was when the second shockwave hit. A former employee of LA Terrace came forward with a statement of their own. Anonymous at first, then later confirmed through verified sources, the employee shared an internal memo from the restaurant's management, one that had been sent before JD Vance had even arrived. The memo detailed a preemptive decision to deny service to specific political figures. It included a list of names, along with explicit instructions on how to remove them without causing a scene. The document confirmed what many had suspected. This was never about policy, never about maintaining a neutral space. It was targeted. It was personal. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. The restaurant's previous statement about inclusivity crumbled under scrutiny. The existence of a blacklist for political figures ignited fresh outrage. Legal experts weighed in, questioning whether the establishment had violated discrimination laws. The revelation also had a chilling effect beyond LA Terrace. Other businesses suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Would more lists like this? Had similar incidents happened in other restaurants, hotels, or public spaces? The controversy had begun with a single meal, but now it was pulling back the curtain on a much larger issue. By the end of the week, LA Terrace had shut down temporarily. Management cited safety concerns due to the ongoing protests and threats made against staff. But the truth was evident. The business was collapsing under the weight of its own decisions. Meanwhile, JD Vance still said nothing. He didn't have to. He had already won. By refusing to fight, he had forced the opposition to defeat itself. By choosing peace, he had exposed the hypocrisy. By walking away, he had proven his point. The final headlines of the week painted a stark contrast. Restaurant that refused JD Vance closes amid scandal. JD Vance's unexpected response turns the tables. The political divide in America just took a darker turn. But the last headline, one from a small independent outlet, captured the real question now lingering in everyone's mind. Where does it end? The controversy had started with a simple act of exclusion, but the fallout had revealed something far more dangerous: the increasing unwillingness of society to coexist with those who think differently. And that was a question no one had an easy answer for. The fallout from the LA Terrace controversy had become bigger than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a single denied meal had now spiraled into a nationwide debate about political exclusion, free speech, and the deepening divides in American culture. Across the country, reactions varied. Some businesses openly sided with the restaurant, declaring their right to refuse service to individuals whose beliefs they opposed. Others distanced themselves from the situation entirely, fearing that any public statement would drag them into the same kind of scrutiny. Major news outlets continued to cover the story, with opinion pieces dissecting every angle. Some questioned whether private establishments should have the power to create ideological boundaries for their patrons. Others argued that political figures, particularly controversial ones, should expect social consequences for their actions. But amid all the noise, one thing was clear. JD Vance had fundamentally altered the conversation. Rather than fueling outrage, he had stepped back. Instead of turning himself into a victim, he had turned his attention elsewhere. He never asked his supporters to retaliate, never encouraged boycotts, never even responded to the second wave of media questions. He had simply let the truth unfold on its own. And then, the real revelation came. A deeper investigation into L.A. Terrace uncovered something the restaurant's management had desperately tried to keep hidden. Beyond the leaked blacklist memo, records surfaced showing that the restaurant had hosted and even catered to other controversial figures in the past. Some of these guests had political beliefs that aligned with the restaurant's public stance, while others had personal histories that made JD Vance's presence seem tame in comparison. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Journalists dug deeper, uncovering past instances where L.A. Terrace had gone out of its way to accommodate high-profile guests with far more polarizing reputations. Suddenly, their claim of neutrality collapsed. The restaurant's actions weren't about maintaining a safe space. They were about controlling who got to exist in that space. Public reaction shifted dramatically. What had once been an issue of whether a private business had the right to refuse service had now become something else entirely. A conversation about selective discrimination. For the first time, even some of the restaurant's initial supporters hesitated. Their arguments about private business rights now seemed weak in the face of exposed double standards. Some public figures who had rushed to defend L.A. Terrace suddenly went silent. Others retracted their earlier statements, insisting that they had only supported the restaurant on principle and had not known about the blacklist or the selective guest treatment. Meanwhile, legal experts entered the conversation. Some argued that L.A. Terrace's actions could be challenged under discrimination laws. Others noted that while political affiliation wasn't a protected class in most states, the targeted nature of the denial and the existence of a documented blacklist could open the door for lawsuits. Calls for legal action grew louder. At the same time, the economic pressure on the restaurant intensified. The initial drop in reservations had turned into full-fledged cancellations. Even those who supported the restaurant's stance had no interest in dining at the epicenter of a political firestorm. By the end of the week, the restaurant had gone from being a cultural battleground to a cautionary tale. And JD Vance? He still hadn't responded. He had moved on. Rather than engage in the ongoing media frenzy, he had returned to his usual work: legislation, public speaking, and community engagement. When asked about the controversy in interviews, he refused to dwell on it, simply stating that his focus was on more important matters. This, more than anything, frustrated his critics. They had expected him to capitalize on the moment, to turn himself into a martyr. But by choosing not to engage, he had denied them the narrative they wanted. Instead of remaining in the spotlight, he had let the restaurant collapse under its own choices. And then, the final blow came. 1 month after the initial incident, L.A. Terrace announced its permanent closure. The official statement cited ongoing challenges and safety concerns as the reason for shutting down. But everyone knew the truth. The business had become unsustainable. The loss of patrons, the legal threats, and the continued media scrutiny had made it impossible to recover. For some, the closure was a victory. It was seen as proof that intolerance, even under the guise of progressive values, carried consequences. For others, it was a warning, a sign of how quickly businesses could be destroyed in the age of viral outrage. Yet, the most striking part of the entire saga was how it ended. JD Vance never celebrated the restaurant's downfall. He never gloated, never made public remarks about the closure, never used it as a political talking point. He let it go, because in the end, the lesson had already been learned. The real question wasn't about JD Vance or LA Terrace anymore. It wasn't even about who had been right or wrong. The deeper issue, the one that now lingered in the minds of everyone who had followed the story, was where the country was heading. If a sitting senator could be turned away from a meal simply because of his political beliefs, what did that mean for ordinary people who didn't hold positions of power? If a restaurant could collapse under the weight of its own selective intolerance, what did that say about the broader state of ideological division? The controversy had started with a single decision, but its aftermath had exposed something far more unsettling. And the biggest question of all remained unanswered. What happens next? The closure of LA Terrace did not mark the end of the conversation. It marked the beginning of something even more unsettling. The story, which had started as a single act of exclusion, had rippled outward, forcing an uncomfortable reflection on the growing chasm in American society. The headlines had faded, but the questions remained. JD Vance had won without ever fighting. His restraint had turned the situation into a parable of modern polarization. His silence had spoken louder than any speech. And yet, as the dust settled, what lingered was a quiet unease. This was not just about one restaurant. It was about what came next. Other businesses took note. Some high-profile restaurants and social clubs began quietly revising their policies, ensuring that nothing resembling LA Terrace's blacklist could be traced back to them. Private establishments feared becoming the next target, whether from conservatives or progressives. The culture war, which had always been waged in the media and online, was now creeping into physical spaces. For the average American, the entire incident became a symbol of something much bigger than JD Vance or a denied dinner reservation. A single question now hovered over workplaces, public spaces, and private gatherings. How much longer could people coexist if they no longer believe in the right to disagree? Some began to ask whether ideological separation had already become inevitable. Political affiliation had begun determining friendships, social circles, even careers. Now, it was determining where people could eat, where they could shop, and where they were welcome at all. The consequences reached beyond the political elite. Stories began emerging of everyday people experiencing similar treatment. Not high-profile figures, not lawmakers, but regular individuals who had walked into the wrong room with the wrong opinions. Some were turned away from businesses. Others were passed over for job promotions. A teacher in California was quietly dismissed after a private conversation was recorded without consent. A conservative writer in New York was denied service at a coffee shop, not by corporate policy, but by a single employee who had recognized her name from Twitter. These incidents, once dismissed as fringe cases, were now part of a much larger pattern. The same divisions that had been growing online for years were solidifying in the real world. Some defended this shift, calling it a necessary correction, a long overdue reckoning for those who had held harmful views for too long. Others warned that this path led somewhere far darker, a future where ideological purges no longer required governments or authoritarian regimes, because society itself had become the enforcer. JD Vance, for his part, remained removed from the fallout. He did not engage in further commentary. He did not seek retribution. Instead, he doubled down on his work in politics, focusing on issues unrelated to the controversy. His refusal to keep the story alive forced others to move on as well. Yet, in private, those who knew him best saw a man who understood that this was only the beginning. In Washington, lawmakers, both Democrat and Republican, began debating whether political discrimination should be addressed through legislation. The question was complicated. Should businesses be allowed to deny service based on ideology? Should political beliefs be protected the same way race, gender, or religion were? Any attempt to define such laws risked unintended consequences. Protecting one group could mean empowering another in unforeseen ways. The debate quickly became another front in the endless war over identity, rights, and the limits of freedom in a fragmented nation. Meanwhile, activists from both sides saw an opportunity. Some conservatives called for protections against political discrimination, fearing that the exclusion of public figures would eventually trickle down to the everyday citizen. Some progressives, however, argued that this was about accountability, not discrimination. To them, allowing public figures like JD Vance into certain spaces was tantamount to legitimizing the beliefs they represented. And then, the final twist came. 6 months after the restaurant's closure, a new establishment opened in its place. The space that had once been LA Terrace had been fully renovated, rebranded under a new name with a new owner. The grand reopening was widely publicized, complete with an exclusive guest list and a promise to restore inclusivity to the space. The announcement raised immediate suspicions. Was this simply a rebranded version of the same exclusionary business? Was it a true attempt to start fresh, or just another chess move in the culture war? On opening night, journalists waited outside, eager to see if anything had changed. The first guests arrived, mostly figures from the entertainment industry, progressive activists, and high-profile names who had supported LA Terrace during the controversy. The atmosphere inside was celebratory. The crisis, it seemed, had been weathered. Then, something unexpected happened. A single guest arrived, dressed in a simple suit, carrying no cameras, no entourage, no media presence. He approached the entrance quietly, stepping into the glow of the neon sign that now bore a new name. It was JD Vance. No invitation, no announcement, just a silent presence, standing before the doors of the restaurant that had once refused him. The reaction was immediate. Conversations inside slowed. Guests who had once defended the restaurant's decision now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Would they allow him in? Would they turn him away again? The owner stepped forward, now facing a moment far more defining than the previous controversy. The decision was not about Vance anymore. It was about the precedent. And then, the doors opened. No statement was made. No arguments were had. Vance entered, took a seat, and ordered a meal. Some guests left. Others remained. The tension lingered, but for the first time, the story ended in silence rather than conflict. There was no headline, no viral moment, no grand political declaration, just a meal. And yet, in that single act, another question was left hanging in the air, one that no one could yet answer. Had something changed? Or was this just a brief pause before the next storm? The country remained divided. The battle lines were still drawn. But for that night, in that space, there was an uneasy truce. A moment of stillness before the next inevitable reckoning. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't over. It was never going to be over. And the next time, it wouldn't just be about a restaurant. It would be about everything.